Well, that's an easy combination. So I guess a couple of things I would tell you. First, as relates to my background, I'm 61 years old. I've been in business ever since I got out of the Army when I was 28. I was an Army brat growing up. My dad was in the service. I went to a military school. I probably was not the most likely candidate in the world to go to a military school, in that I was not particularly well disciplined in high school. But military school for me was a great experience. And it was really the delivery system more so than anything else. And, soldiering was the family business. So having lived on Army posts, it was perfectly comfortable to me. But the delivery system, in particular studying engineering, being forced to go to class, being forced to be on time, being forced to study, was exactly the guiding hand that I needed. And so everything that I was wandering off the straight and narrow in high school was reinforced quite quickly when I went to military school.
Yeah.
My days in military school, I went to Virginia Military Institute, which produced most of the leaders for the South in the Confederate War. So Stonewall Jackson, as an example, was a professor at VMI. Its reputation and its methodology had been formed for well over 100 and some odd years, 130, 40 years by the time I arrived. So they knew exactly what they were doing. And so they strip you bare. You come there the first day, they shave your head. And you may have been a big shot when you walked through those gates, but when you got out of the barber's chair, you were just another guy with a shaved head. And so that leveling experience was really the beginning of building you back up. They had absolutely no mercy as it related to academics. I studied engineering. I made an F in calculus the first grading period. Ultimately ended up making an A, but I had never seen the letter F on a report card in my entire life. And so it was a wonderful, humbling experience. And my faculty advisor, who was really one of the greatest influences on my life, looked at me and said, "Which branch of the military are you going to go into? Because if you get an F, you get kicked out and you go directly into the Army because the draft is on." I didn't have any problem going in the Army. I just wanted to make sure I was going as an officer. So that was a wonderful experience. At the end of that year, I was so motivated, I was #1 in my class. And I really had no inkling that I had any kind of a brain. I'd always kind of gotten along on, baloney and being quick-witted enough. I didn't get bad grades, but, I certainly was not a stellar student. But at the end of that first year, I was absolutely scared straight. And so suddenly I awoke in myself the ability to study and do well. And so I would say in all of the things that ever had an influence on my life, that first year at VMI was really a very, very, very telling experience. I was in the military. I served overseas in a number of different locations. I was in the combat engineers. Combat engineers are the same branch that MacArthur was in and Robert E. Lee was in. Very difficult to get in. They get the best officers. You have to be able to fight like infantry in an infantry division. And then you also have to be able to do all of your engineering tasks. You have to be able to build airfields and dams and roads and bridges and open up rock quarries and asphalt plants and concrete plants. And then when that's all done, then you got to pick up a rifle and fight like infantry. The combat engineers are real funny because we used to force river crossings. So the infantry division came up to a river and you'd force a crossing, going across in little rubber boats underneath the protection of smoke, and then the infantry would come across. Mm-hmm. And so we were always the point of the spear. My experiences in the military were just fabulous. I learned every single thing I ever needed to know about business as a platoon leader and a company commander. And the first and only rule you had to ever remember was take care of your men. And if you did that, whether it was their physical safety or protection or tactics or fighting or food or bullets or water or family problems or legal problems, if you did that, everything was going to turn out okay. And so it was a wonderful experience. I also had a kind of a funny experience in that the draft was on, so you had people from every segment of America. And so you'd go out there and say, hey, we need somebody to fix the tile in the latrines. Some guy would raise his hand and say, I was the largest tile contractor in Miami before I got drafted. And so my company clerk had a PhD in English from St. Joseph's University. And so he handled all my correspondence when I was a company commander. So that experience, I went to business school on the GI Bill. I got out, I went to work for Mobile Corporation. My first job for Mobile Corporation was working for the chairman of Mobile. And so that was a wonderful experience. Funny story was I was going from Toronto to New York. They lost my luggage. I was flying Air Canada. I showed up for my interview. I was staying at the Waldorf Astoria. I had blue jeans, a pink shirt, and topsiders. So the Waldorf Astoria cleaned my clothes overnight. I went over to my interview, which was 7 o'clock in the morning. The chairman's name was Raleigh Warner. And I said to Mr. Warner, I said, a day will come when you need something done. You won't take any excuses. So here I am, lost luggage and all. He stuck his head outside, told everybody else who was waiting for an interview that the job was filled. And so it was a great learning experience that, just like in the military, the mission is the first thing. You got to get the job done. I worked for Mobile for a number of years. I worked in the real estate department. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life because this company had no problem with money. Most businesses, the number one problem they have is, do we have enough capital? Mobile didn't have any problems at all. And it actually resulted a little bit in maybe some not as strong budget discipline as you would like to have had, because they had enough money to be able to incur and embrace any mistake. Learned a lot about building with them. Went to work for a guy in Austin, Texas, whose name was Jack Crosby, finest entrepreneur that I've ever met in my life, the absolute best deal guy I've ever met in my life. I literally saw this guy turn water into wine and lead into gold, watching him negotiate deals, and a bit of it rubbed off. And I easily would have paid lots of tuition for that experience. I worked for him for a number of years. I had my own shingle in the real estate business, built some tall buildings, which was very, very complex, and it appealed to both my engineering experience and my business experience. When I look at a building, I actually don't even see it. I see the substructure, and I see the foundation, and I see the superstructure, and I see the skin and the electrical, mechanical, and plumbing and fire protection systems. When I walk in the room, the first thing I do is look at the ceiling. All real estate developers, when they walk in the room, they look at the ceiling, because if you have a nice flat ceiling, you know that building is very well built. And then I was successful in that. I sold all of that in the mid-'90s. I tried to retire when I was 45. The worst personal mistake I ever made in my life. 6 months, my IQ went down about 50 points, and I didn't have any points to spare. And I went from being very, very intellectually engaged to really just working on my tan. And, you know, working on your tan does not require a very high IQ. So I had that experience. It took me about 3 years to get off the bench. When I went back to work, it really was a struggle to get my brain working again. I have run public companies, and I've run private companies. I consider myself a bit of a leader, and I don't say that because I think that I have any particular great talent. If you look at the life experiences I've had, it was forced upon me. And I think within everyone, there is a talent for leadership. The question is whether or not it's developed. I have a very keen appreciation that we have no extraordinary men. We simply have ordinary men who are thrust in extraordinary circumstances, and the friction of that circumstance reveals their character. The character carries them to where they need to be. On that score, I would use President Eisenhower as the perfect example of that. A farm kid from Kansas who ended up running the whole damn world just because he rose to the occasion in every difficult situation he was ever placed in. So that's kind of my story. About 4 or 5 months ago, I stopped running a little public company I was running. I still own a big chunk of it. And so I'm back in startup and entrepreneurial business. I've got a couple of deals that I'm working on. And actually, I was advising last week a couple of folks that I had met on FredWilson'sADC.com. So there is one thimbleful of my story.
That's wonderful. So you know, it sounds like there have been a bunch of defining moments on the way, right? You mentioned a couple. VMI seemed to be a defining moment, and also your first, I think, big deal mentor and entrepreneurial mentor seems another. But What are some of those, big moments that you look back at and say, wow, in hindsight, that made all the difference in the world?
Well, I think, one of the great lessons for today is how you deal with and confront and overcome a bad economy. In the S&L crisis in the late, I guess in the mid 80s and through really the mid 90s, the economy where I lived in Texas was really just awful. And, I always say to people that tough times don't continue, but tough people prevail. And the lessons that I learned in that period of time were just monumental. I mean, it was literally like being in combat. And every assumption as to how you would run a business was challenged. And so I look back on that experience, and while I know that the companies that I was running prevailed, and I know they prevailed because we ended up selling them for huge profits at some time in the future, I have to tell you that every day there was a question as to whether or not I could make payroll in the next 2 weeks. And so those experiences, they really test you and they make you very, very tough. And so that would be one thing I would say is a defining moment. Now, having said that, I would also say to you that while I lived through it and I'm proud of it, I would tell you that any man, any woman, any person who puts their mind to it can do the same thing. There are no miracles. All you have to do is keep putting one foot in front of the other. And as long as you decide, I will never quit, then nobody can ever defeat you. No set of circumstances can ever overcome you. You just have to keep showing up every single morning. I also think that as humans, we need and like challenges. And so, when I went to, as an example, when I went to airborne school and I went to Ranger school, I might not have said it at the time, but I would certainly say now in retrospect, honestly, I didn't know if I could make it. And so that legitimate test, the willingness to test ourselves in difficult circumstances, whether it's running a business, raising money, creating a new product, that's really the driver. And that's recognition of that is also what I think really reveals perhaps your entrepreneurial sense. And I think it's a bit cyclical. I think sometimes the force is powerful. I think other times you need a little bit of rest. And so I think it's all a matter of negotiating with yourself. And in some ways, I'm my own best coach. In other ways, I'm my own largest critic. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that as I become fatigued, whether it's at the end of a day, I just need to go and recharge my batteries. And the next morning, I come to work and I say, why did I ever feel like that last night? Because I know today I'm going to bite the ass off a bear. And so as long as you have that spirit and realize that that's what's within you, then I think you can prevail. So I think tough times, I think that's one thing. I think another thing is related to health. When I was in my mid-40s, I contracted hepatitis. And it's a very dangerous disease at that age. Most kids in Texas have already had that as a child. So my kids, when they were tested, they both had the hepatitis antibodies. And so I was looking down the barrel of a gun, and it was a very, very serious situation. About 5% of the people who contract hepatitis in their 40s die. And so it forced me to reevaluate things. And so I think that survivor mentality, both in the marketplace and in the economy, and that survivor mentality as it relates to your own personal health, are very, very powerful drivers as to how you see the perspective of life. For most of my business career, I was a guy in a blue suit, and I'd have blue shirt with white cuffs and French cuffs and Hermes ties and cufflinks and everything. And here you see me today in front of this camera, and the greatest privilege that I have is I can come to work now in blue jeans. I can wear khakis. The funny thing about it is I get up earlier, I work harder, I'm more engaged than I've ever been before, but I'm also more comfortable. And if I have to wear a blue suit, I do it. But now it's my choice as opposed to being forced upon me. And so one of the great revelations for everybody is what is really their own personal value system. And so the ability to control your time, I think, is extremely powerful. And I think the ability to work in a comfortable atmosphere, and I think the ability to work with good men and women, I think these are all some of the greatest blessings that you have. I'm fond of saying that a real entrepreneur would rather command a rowboat than be the second in command on the QE2 because you've got the whip in your hand. And so you can drive yourself, you can drive the enterprise yourself. And I think that that's the greatest blessing that you can ever have. It's also one of the secrets, I think, of the American economy. And that the real driver of the American economy is the small businessman who has the ability to fashion his own strategy, go out and execute it, and then reap the benefits of it.
So here's a question for you. This is a topic that's very close to heart, which is mentors. And I know you have your opinion on that. It would be great to get a sense of what role mentorship has played in your life, and I know just your views on this whole relationship between a mentor and a mentee.
Well, I think the first thing is I don't believe there's been a minute in my life where I have not had a mentor. And so it starts out first with parents, and nobody in my family had gone to college, and my mother never, ever, ever tolerated a notion that all of her children were not going to go to college. My mother and father were two of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, and to this day, I've never met anybody smarter than my father. And so the way they managed us and our expectations was beyond belief. We never once ever, myself and my two sisters, all of whom have MBAs, we never once ever thought there was a possibility that we weren't going to college. When I was at VMI has just the most powerful leadership development program you'd imagine. There was one man in particular who was the commandant of cadets, and his name was Colonel Buchanan, Buck Buchanan, highly decorated Marine in World War II, highly decorated Army officer in the Korean War. And he was the kind of guy that VMI puts in contact with cadets. Now, as a cadet, I was a very good student. I was scared into it. In my first year, I was number one in my class, but I absolutely did not know that to be the case. When I looked at the class rankings, which were posted in the arch of the barracks there at VMI, I was the most surprised person in the entire Corps of Cadets because I just couldn't imagine that was the case. But then I looked at all those A's I'd gotten, and I thought, well, that's the way the math worked. But it wasn't because I was striving to be number one. I was just trying to do my best. So I'm headed off to Army summer camp. And I was a serious student, and I was a passing and tolerable military cadet. I did not get excited about the military because having grown up in a military family, I realized that VMI was not the Army. So I didn't have the shiniest shoes, and I didn't have the closest haircut, and I just got by because I wanted to spend all my time and energy in the classroom. So this commandant of cadets called me in. You go in there, it's very unusual to have a conversation with commandant of cadets. I walked in, I saluted him. He said, I just want to tell you one thing, Minch. Don't embarrass VMI at summer camp this summer. And I was so thoroughly pissed off. And every single thing I did at summer camp that year resonated in my ear, his voice. I was running, we had to run 2 miles. I beat everybody in my battalion. And resonating in my voice was, damn it, I showed Colonel Buchanan everything. So I ended up being the top cadet in the whole country in summer camp. So we marched back in, and I'm looking on the archway there at VMI, and on the wall is all the rank of every single person, how they'd done that year at summer camp, graded against the whole country. So there's about 10,000 cadets who were graded at the same time. And there I was, number one, and Colonel Buchanan walked up silently behind me, whispering in my left ear, Minch, I knew you could do it. And I had been played like a fiddle. And the wisdom and formation of young men, of their leadership talent, of motivating them that he had demonstrated, was like Einstein. And the thing about it is he knew the entire time exactly what he was doing. And I can assure you that the motivation that I had was real, it was genuine, it was sincere, and it was as passionate as it could possibly be, because goddamn it, I was going to show Colonel Buchanan that he was wrong.
Yeah.
And the entire time, he was just playing a big fat trout on a hook. He knew exactly what he was doing. Later on, when I became a professional soldier, and I would see him from time to time, we had not a peer-to-peer, but a professional-to-professional relationship. And it was one of the funniest things in the world when he would say something like, well, Minch, I knew you'd probably do okay at summer camp. I just had to get those fires going. That's an example. When I was in business, I had a partnership that lasted for 13 years, and it was a great partnership. It ended because we sold all the assets. So it was one of those things where we built a business from scratch. I mean, literally, two guys shaking hands over a napkin, built that business, made hundreds of millions of dollars of profit. And in that 13-year period, we had one disagreement. We agreed to sleep on it. We came back the next morning, we had a cup of coffee, and I said, so what did you think? And at the same instant, we both blurted out, you were right, meaning the other person was right. So you look at that and you can't imagine how perfect that fit was. And it was totally serendipitous. When we started that partnership out, I was the guy who knew how to build things, and I knew how to lease them up, and I knew how to operate them. And my partner was the financier. He knew his way around the capital markets, and we made the most perfect partnership you could imagine. At the peak of it, we had about 500 employees, and we were one of the largest owners of apartments in the United States. We built and renovated high-rise office buildings. We owned a bunch of warehouses, and in that whole period of time, we did not have one cross word. And so it was just a wonderful experience. And I look back now, and that person is still a mentor to me. And so, that relationship has been extremely valuable. It's been extremely sacred, and it's been extremely productive both ways. I'll see that guy about every 6 months or so, and we'll have a chat, and we can speak in a shorthand, having lived through that experience, that he could make the most critical assessment of anything I did, and in turn, I could return the favor. Excuse me a second.
No.
That was President Obama calling me, and I'm just not going to be able to talk to him right now. I have to wait until after our call. But busy guy. But anyway, that sincerity, that strength in that partnership is the product of 25 years of knowing that guy. And so, those things are powerful. Now, I invested a lot of energy in that relationship, and I was coming asking questions. And I was at his disadvantage when it started. He was the older guy by a few years. And as we developed, that thing ended up being a different kind of relationship that we became more peer-to-peer. And so it's become a very, very valuable relationship. When my son was born, that guy was the first guy who wasn't a family member who held my son in his hands. And so it's been a good relationship. So one of the things I'd say to you is if you want to have a mentor relationship, you're going to have to seek out the right people. I don't buy into any of this business that it should be awkward, difficult. Love yourself. Go in there and get the best help you possibly can, and be humble and be aggressive and ask for the help of the people who can really help you. And in turn, return it to other people. In my business career, one of the greatest, most gratifying things that ever occurred is to see the success of people who work for me. So when I sold that real estate business, I had a bunch of young studs and talent to work for me, and the things that they've accomplished really just bring a smile to my face. Many of them own their own businesses. Many of them are presidents of companies. And I'll meet them and we'll talk about some. A young guy who's, 25 years my junior at that time will say, Jeff, every single thing I ever needed to know, I learned from you. And today, they're running good-sized operations, and they'll laugh and they'll say, and I used to think that you were really a prick, Jeff. But every single thing that you, taught me of checking, double checking, and rechecking everything has turned out to be a sense for my success in business. And so it's just a wonderful thing to, be able to do that. The other thing is that returning more than you have received. I think that's part of the game of life. And I think doing it in a humble manner and doing it in a way that other people don't necessarily see your footsteps. And the things that people do. I mean, I was quite taken by learning about Mitt Romney's personal generosity and his reluctance to have some of those stories known. Now, I wish that he had become president, but he hasn't. But I do feel great about knowing that a guy like that really has left real footsteps with the wealth that he had created and with his character. And that makes me feel very good about America, that a guy like that could do something like that. That is the American dream. And I think all of us have a duty. Now, the other thing is, I think the more of it that you do, the more of it that comes back to you. And so, I look at our relationship, how you and I met each other, what a fabulous dividend. And, the ability for you and I to speak and converse and talk about things and learn from each other, it's just one of the most powerful things in the world. And it's something that's very, very, very unique to that entire community that surrounds Fred Wilson. And I think it starts with him. And people like that are attracted to other people like that. And so I think the entire community there at abc.com is really quite extraordinary.
Very true. So I guess final couple of questions as we're running out of time, I guess. One is a quick one, Jalen. So what are some of a couple of your favorite productivity hacks where you attribute your efficiency to?
Well, you got to remember, I'm a little bit older than most people who've been involved with technology. So I actually was in business when we used to use green and white accounting paper, and I used to think that the HP 12C calculator was really something. So in my lifetime, I bought the first Apple IIc that was ever purchased in Austin, Texas, and I used it to do interest rate calculations for high-rise office buildings.
Okay.
So I made a little model using VisiCalc, and I showed it to some guys. They said, "You're not going to believe this. I'm going to change the interest rate assumption, and in 45 seconds, the results will be on that screen." Can you imagine saying to somebody today that your screen will change in 45 seconds? So I've ridden the curve up, and I'm a bit of a gadget guy. And so I'm a guy with a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, a desktop, an office computer. And so I like everything about technology. I like every single thing about every kind of productivity software. And, I'm an Evernote slave and all. And so I just think that there's so much data, there's so much information out there that not to be informed about everything that's going on in the world is really tragedy.
Yeah.
I live with Skype. I mean, I think Skype is the greatest thing in the world. And my only regret, Rohan, is that we haven't been on Skype before.
Yeah.
Because it's such a great experience. And I just think that everything about technology. So I think that you have to keep your skills sharp. I think you got to invest some time in it. I think you got to have all of those implements, and then you got to be in touch. Now, one other thing I also think is you also have to have some quiet time. And so every once in a while, you got to turn all that stuff off, put it in a drawer, and go spend, a week skiing, or you got to go spend an hour, swimming or do something in order to be able to refresh your brain. It's unbelievable how productive you can become if you master that. Now, one of my theories of business is what I call the 360-degree businessman. And you've got to know everything about the business model that you're operating, the regulatory environment that you're in, leadership, management, litigation, legislation, lobbying. You can just get down the list. And part of that is you've got to be able to master the technology. So you've got to be able to do a little bit of desktop publishing because you've got to be able to communicate. And you've got to be able to do things like operate SurveyMonkey, and you got to be able to do all kinds of different little things that the average CEO would say, well, I'll get somebody to do that. Yeah. And the reason is that you don't really understand the sensitivities until your fingertips are actually touching each one of those things, which means that you got to learn a lot of stuff. I learned how to fly an airplane when I was 50 years old, and I said to myself, I don't want to learn how to do it. I want to master it.
Yeah.
So the average person getting a license spent 40 hours, and then they went and took their test.
Yeah.
I spent 250 hours before I took my test. I took my written test. I went out and flew with the designated examiner, and he looked at me and he said, are you sure you're here for this test? Because you already know how to fly an airplane. And so I think one of the things, part of my 360-degree businessman theory is mastery as opposed to familiarity. And so I just think there's a million things out there that you can master them. And if you do master them, then I think you're in a position to be able to prevail in the competitive marketplace we find ourselves in today.
Final question. If there's one idea that you'd like to share, what would that be?
Well, I guess I would say that one of the great tragedies that's going on in the world right now is all of the war and horror and everything else. And, what's going on, as an example, in the Middle East and the competition between us and China and us and Russia and all the money that's being spent on weapons. And, having been a professional soldier and having seen war up close, there's nothing that is as obscene and as degrading as these kinds of things. Down to the lowest level. So you take the macro, and that's absolutely obscene. And then you come down to kind of the micro, and it gets down to something very simple, and that is that all of us get back what we invest. And so the niceness, the courtesies that you would provide, the humility that one would exude in personal relationships comes back 1,000-fold. Furthermore, the genuineness, the sincerity, the authenticity that one brings to every relationship, simple courtesies. Punctuality is the courtesy of kings because they have nothing else that they can really give. And so in all of our personal relationships, it just seems to me as though we should be more humble and God-fearing about everything that's going on. And you wouldn't think about that as being a business theory, but it really is. And so whether you're dealing with failure, and I think that failure is tuition, whether you're dealing with triumph, whether you're, in a political position, doing the right thing by those circumstances and doing it in the right way is the greatest contribution that we can make to comity in general, to the sweetness of life. It's like the American Constitution. You're entitled to, as an American, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nobody said you were going to catch happiness. Nobody guaranteed you an outcome, but they did say that you could take a crack at getting it. And that's the humble approach that we ought to be taking toward everything that we do.
Oh, that's brilliant, Jalen.